to introduce Professor Stu Fairclough to you. We've kind of landed a queue in relation to, we asked Stuart, would he act as an adjunct professor within our department of PEPAYS. So I'm delighted that we have somebody's CV who clearly doesn't sleep. A huge amount of publications, organisations he's worked with, very, very impressive. And the real interest we have with Stuart is his capacity to look at physical activity, physical education, to work across the two. That's a real attraction for us within our own department as well, in relation to the research themes that we have. And I think in relation to PEPAYS, the actual themes that we have, particularly physical activity, active schools, active community, Stuart's very well positioned, particularly to talk to that group. So I'm absolutely delighted, Stuart, that you're here and you're able to share some of your time with us. And Stuart obviously will have a remit in trying to help us both from PEPAYS and guests and how we can actually try and take this agenda on and be more productive and proactive in it. I'm delighted you're giving your time, folks. I know it's week 13. It's a busy week in relation to everything that's arisen from semester. But thank you for your time. Stuart, do you want to present with engagement, or would you rather people wait until the end? What's your preference?
Freestyle.
Freestyle. Now there's an invitation. Okay, freestyle it is. But we'll see what works. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you, Anne, and I'd like to just thank you, I guess, in this forum particularly for being admitted to the adjunct at the university, and I was very excited and quite humbled actually to be involved with this group, which I've kind of seen from afar for quite a few years. So thank you for that, and I hope I can be a valuable contributor to some of the things that you do. I think Anne's alluded to kind of my background a little bit, and I'll talk to that as we go through, but obviously a very long-winded title. I wanted to get something which might actually spark a little bit of interest amongst a range of colleagues in the faculty, sort of across the kind of phys ed and science programmes. So I'll talk about that a little bit. I've been at Liverpool John Moores up until October this year for about 13 years, primarily on the teacher training programme of physical education, and then in the last 4 years leading to activity exchange in the Research Institute for Sport and Exercise Sciences. So I've kind of, I think I can speak about this kind of PE exercise science and maybe my kind of reflections on how they fit together. And I'm now at Edge Hill University in the northwest of England, and our department is has some synergies to your department as well, but within that role I'm overseeing and managing the PE school sport team, so I'll kind of come back full circle a little bit while still really growing the physical activity research. So I'll touch on that, but hopefully it's just some relevance maybe to all of you in the room, and hopefully in a little tiny bit for some of you. So I've got my details on there, so feel free to get in touch if you need to. So a little bit, first of all, said I'm at Edge Hill, that's in Ormskirk in Lancashire. If you're not sure what that is, well, there's Manchester, there's Liverpool, and we're kind of just up there. It's a lovely rural kind of market town. I don't know if you know, but we were named Times Higher Education University of the Year last year. So small institution, but one that's going places, and a lot of things to do there, which I'll come on to a little bit. In terms of our provision, we are a Department of Sport and Physical Activity. We have a PE School Sport undergraduate programme. It's a Faculty of Education which has a very strong physical education, teacher training provision. We have a Sport and Exercise Science degree pathway, undergrad and MRes provision as well. Sports therapy, sports management, sports coaching. So there's a lot going on, if you like, and I think there are some potential synergies maybe moving forward with some of the things that you do here. Okay, so this is background, so if you just allow me just to go through this a little bit. I know the picture's a wee bit small, but where have I come from? So you can get to know a little bit more about me, aside from the fact that I do a bit of running, do a bit of biking if you look at Twitter. I kind of come from a PE teacher training background, so That is me in the background with some hair, by the way, but this is me as a student. I've got some kids in there at the gym at Liverpool John Moores in the Iron Marsh Morrison gym. So I guess like a lot of people who fall into this kind of role, I was a bit of a sport bully at school and really wanted to be a PE teacher, and there's nothing beyond that for me in life. And I was lucky enough to undertake that programme. But whilst doing that, I got really interested in the exercise science and health aspect of physical education. So that kind of sparked an interest in me. I'm not in that picture, by the way, but this is a long-time colleague, Professor Gareth Stratton, who's now at Swansea University, with some really old-fashioned lab kit there. That's Gareth's son in the picture. So that kind of sparked enthusiasm in me. I then I was a PE teacher in Wigan, where I'm from, taught in high school in Wigan. Fantastic times there. It's me with my class and on the last day. And then I actually left that post to go full-time at Loughborough to do a Masters, and I did an MSc in Sports Science. So I kind of come from that being the be-all and end-all to getting more into this, still having this interest here, but a little bit frustrated because I couldn't actually do anything about it. So I kind of bit the bullet, saved up some money, went full-time, did my MSc at Loughborough, fortunate enough to get a job back in the Northwest at Liverpool Hope University on PE, sport pedagogy programmes. Then I moved to John Moores on the PE teacher training programmes, and there I, amongst other things, led the exercise science part of that degree and the research methods. And whilst at JMU, I started doing my PhD, got my PhD, and I've told you about in sports sciences. So I've kind of come from there to there to there to there, and I feel I've got a nice kind of, if you like, breadth around phys ed and sport exercise sciences. So that's a little bit about me. I guess today I'm going to talk around physical activity in relation to schools. So I'm sure everyone in the room very much kind of follows that philosophy here, that physical activity, pretty untapped, pretty amazing as a commodity. We can't package it and we can't market it and sell it as such, because it relies on people's behaviours and people's attitudes and so on and so forth. But a lot of good evidence, so particularly in adults, we know that the more active we are typically, or the more intense our activity, or the fitter we are, typically then the health benefits will follow that. And the dose response is steepest amongst the least active. So it's a real kind of powerful message. A lot of good evidence in adults. Less evidence in children, but the same kind of relationships, of course, do occur. So depending on how we measure health, this is just one example from the European Youth Heart Study, and this is cardiometabolic risk. But basically, the most active or children who do the most intense activity tend to have the lower risk. So a lot of good rationale, if you like, from a health perspective in terms of the evidence, not strong in children. From an economic point of view, physical activity can turn the public health best buy, if you like, because it is implicated in a number of chronic conditions which cost the health services across the world a significant amount of money. So there's that kind of picture as well, which impacts on government and policy. Children's physical activity then, which I'll kind of focus on a little bit more specifically now. So typically, children spend most of their day in sedentary behaviours. These are boys, these are girls, and these are ages. When they're not being sedentary, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, more time is spent in light activities, not really doing anything which is going to be significantly impacting upon health. And a small amount of time is spent in the day engaging in moderate levels of activity and above which are known to be more beneficial for health. And as we'll see here, with age, these levels of MBPA get lower. So this is a kind of common picture, and it's really consistent throughout the world, wherever we look. So because we know that there are some issues around activity levels in young people, there are guidelines for physical activity. So the Chief Medical Officers of the UK published theirs, and I located the Irish guidelines, and I'm not sure, these are from 2009, I don't know if they're current or not, or whether they've been updated. They're current, okay. And typically, like most guidelines for young people, They tell a similar, if you like, story in terms of how much activity young people should do, around 1 hour minimum per day. So we know that, and we know that the majority of young people don't achieve that. A little bit higher in the Irish children. These are self-report data, so possibly a little bit overestimated. So looking at around maybe a third of boys, around a fifth of girls, typically, from objective measures. Worryingly, I guess, when this is data is reported in adults, the numbers are in single figures. So we see this decline through childhood, through adolescence, and then a big poof drop off. And again, consistent messages wherever you kind of look around this stuff. Very briefly mention sedentary behaviours. So to the layperson, we see sedentary as being the same as being inactive, but I guess we define really inactive as not meeting physical activity guidelines, where sedentary behaviours are a different set of behaviours altogether. So the scientific definition would be around a criterion net level of energy expenditure. And these are those typical kind of behaviours.
Okay.
Should I glue that? Blue tag? Try and put that in. So you guys are all being sedentary now, so I'm being a little bit better than you. I'm doing a little light activity in my movement, so feel free if you want to stand up throughout the talk, that's fine as well. But typically, think about kids, they do these type of things very, very frequently. So the school setup is typically we're all seated. Leisure pursuits very often involve screen time, which involves being seated or lying down, so on. So there's a lot of opportunity for sedentary behaviours which aren't great. And again, consistently, this is kind of UK data, but it's similar from North America, between 6 and 9 hours a day typically, excluding sleep time, will be spent being sedentary. So that's a third chunk, I'm sure you agree. What's important, I guess, to note here is that sedentary behaviours are now recognised as risk factors for different indices of health, independent of how much physical activity people do. So you could be, a typical certain weekend warrior has been bandied about. So people who really, really blast loads of physical activity out at certain times, maybe at weekends or go to the gym in the evenings, and then do nothing for long periods of time. And although there's some protection, if you like, from the physical activity, that is stripped away a little bit from the sedentary behaviours. So it's important to recognise from a public health promotion point of view, promoting physical activity is important, but also reducing sedentary behaviours are important. And the key here is to break up prolonged sedentary time. And so when I said please feel free to stand up, I was only half joking. It's feel free to do it. So sedentary, a little bit small, but actually in the systematic review, so a number of kind of, if you like, biological risk factors noted here around body comp, fitness and so on, but also a negative risk for some psychosocial outcomes, pro-social behaviours, academic achievement. So it's all kind of wrapped up, if you like, in terms of what are the risks to health of these behaviours. So a few challenges, I guess. We know that young people aren't as active as they should be. We know that they are too sedentary. We know that there are high levels of overweight and obesity. All the things that we kind of read about in the media. And from a health perspective, different, if you like, outcomes, but certainly in terms of long-term and chronic diseases that occur in adults, and the risk factors for these things are borne out in young children, and being low active and being sedentary can only exacerbate those risk factors. So ideally we want some kind of integrated lifestyle package, I guess, which involves being active and involves nutritional behaviours. Now I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to even attempt to talk around that. It's physical activity. So we should promote activity in kids, and that message has been around a long time, but is that a strong message, and why? So it's been proposed that there are certain pathways to support this rationale, and the most direct one is, well, if they're active when they're kids, they're going to be active when they're adults. But the tracking data to support that notion isn't particularly strong, so It's weak to moderate at best, I guess, depending on the longitudinal studies, for a number of reasons. The other pathways are linked to health outcomes, and the rationale, I guess, is around, well, if we can be active here, we're less likely to be at risk of be exposed to certain risk factors. Therefore, childhood health is better. Therefore, that has a knock-on effect on adult health. We've got a pathway here leading straight to disease at adulthood. So basically, these are kind of indirect knock-on effects. This is the most kind of obvious pathway, but it's all kind of wrapped in together. So although the evidence for these things isn't that strong because it relies on longitudinal studies, we can't almost take a leap of faith by what we know from the cross-sectional observational work to say that, yeah, this is the way that we should go. So there's all kind of notions about, well, what age should we really try and intervene? Should we do preschoolers? Should we do adolescents? Not an easy one to answer. Just to confound matters as well is that we know that the behaviour of physical activity is multidimensional, so there are a lot of different influences which can cause people's behaviours to change one way or the other. So do we focus on increasing fitness or body composition? Is it about enjoyment and improving competencies? Difficult one because there are a lot of these correlates. How do we actually unpick them all? So we might rely on established models. So this is a youth physical activity promotion model, something that we've used a lot in our work. And it's real nice because it tries to, if you like, put some kind of hierarchical order on the main correlates of physical activity in kids. And it labels them in terms of these different factors. So without talking through this in much detail, the demographic makeup of the population would underpin the model. It goes from the bottom upwards. The important role of family social influences would be up here. That's a direct effect on the physical activity behaviour. These are called enabling factors. So, am I a boy or a girl? I know I'm a boy, obviously, but that would be, a question which might dictate how active I'm going to be. What's my fitness status? What are my fundamental movement skills like? What's my environment like for going and being active? Have I got a facility like this on my doorstep? Do I live in a high-rise block? So all these kind of factors play a role here. And then at the heart of the model, we've got these predisposing factors. It's been reported that kids ask themselves two questions when they're faced with physical activity. And one is, am I able to do it? And the second one is it worth doing? And so we've got these, it's almost like cost benefit for a young person. So the am I able is about the competency and competencies, and the is it worth it is about attitudinal beliefs and values. So the arrows really tell the story. Some of the arrows go straight to activity, some of them pass through. These two and the bottom one pass through predisposing, which suggests that actually this is the thing to tap into if we want to try and actually change people's behaviours rather than focusing purely on biological outcomes, for example, or the social outcomes. It's got to be maybe a combination which will actually impact on the psychosocial decision making that young people do. You'll see that I like the model, so I'll keep coming back to different ones. So we've got a case for the school then, all right? So I won't go on the first couple of slides here too much. So why the school to promote physical activity? Well, quite a few bits of research typically demonstrate that during the school hours, children engage actually in more activity than they do outside the school hours, which surprises some people because of what we said already about spending a lot of time being seated and being sedentary. But there are a lot of opportunities in the school day, so perhaps they can be further exploited. Kids go to school every day, so they're a captive audience, so that's good for us as researchers. We've got classrooms, we've got teachers, we've got facilities, we've got a curriculum, so we've got a kind of infrastructure that we can build upon. A captive audience that spends a lot of time in that particular establishment over the course of the year. And schools are community hubs with links back to parents and families, links to the local community. So some of the stuff we've done suggests that at least half of daily activity in kids is spent at school, is accrued in the school From from a physical activity policy recommendations point of view. So these are the NICE recommendations for physical activity promotion in young people. And these are, if you like, the key priorities that's summarised in that document. And pretty much all of them relate to the school setting. Okay. So whether these are targeted at parents or deliverers or policymakers or local government, they're actually all can be related to the school environment. I sit on the NICE evidence update group for these guidelines, and we had the meeting last week reviewing evidence, if you like, to see if these need updating. And I'm not breaking any big secrecies here by saying they don't need updating because the evidence base hasn't changed too much, which in relation to what we're talking about here suggests that the school is still a really important environment for physical activity promotion. Another model, sorry. So just to kind of keep with the rationale for schools, if in terms of a model to, if you like, promote health and well-being and physical activity, this is a socio-ecological model, multi-levels, I guess, and the school is kind of situated here in terms of organisational, and what we're trying to get to, if we can apply this model, or interventions can apply this model, what it kind of says is, well, we can reach many more people than if you have an intervention at individual level, then you might get a good effect with a small group of people. If you can put intervention at the level of the school, you can reach many, many more people. If it's intervention at national government legislation level, so for example, making driving without seatbelts illegal, for example, then you see a big change in people's behaviours. So school is well positioned here because it can actually infiltrate down, and we can make changes at that level, then we can possibly target many people. So schools are important for this kind of work. Okay. So school-based activity promotion. Traditionally, we would always think about that in years gone by as being phys ed, as being PE in school. Apologies for the wonkiness of that scanned image up there, but this is a paper published in 1991 by James Sallis and Tom McKenzie from San Diego. And this is the paper, if you like, which kind of dropped a penny with me in terms of this is what I want to do for my PhD. This is the most important thing in the world. It's a seminal paper, just a discussion paper. But the title says it all, really. And that's what comes through for me. So this is this notion of PE programmes preparing people to be physical activity over the life course. And that's what PE programmes should be about in relation to being health promoting. So I've still got a tatty version of this, full of marks and comments, but it's a really important paper. They updated it a few years ago, actually. Staying with, if you like, some important people in this field. So Charles Corbyn, extensive work in this area as well. He coined the phrase physical activity education. What is that? Well, what is a physically educated person? And it's not just about being active and the action of being active or accumulating activity, it's about actually these things as well. So we go back to the youth physical activity promotion model, it's about the positive attitudes, it's about having the physical skill to do it, about the self-management skills to go and be active. And you know, these predisposing factors, really central for this notion of being physical, having physical activity education. And again, linked into lifelong activity. So the role of PE is potentially very, very central to this notion of making people or enabling people to be active in the long term. And this was nicely conceptualised in this review paper a few years ago. The notion here is that, well, PE can contribute to physical activity in a couple of ways. So in a direct way, by children's activity during the lesson per se, and in an indirect manner. So the indirect manner might be, okay, out of class activity, maybe what goes on after school or on the playground and so on. And more challenging is long-term physical activity. So lots of evidence for this, not a lot of evidence for this, and hardly any evidence for this. One study, the Trois-Rivières study, from way back when, but demonstrated PE intervention in primary school showed positive effects on activity behaviours and health outcomes in females when they're in adulthood, not in males. But there's scarce information out about those long-term benefits, because those studies are so difficult to do. Even if the effect of the problem was really, really good, really hard to track people over that time. So although this is kind of aspirational, we ain't got a lot of evidence to say, well, yeah, PE can do that. Right? If it can, usually it's quite anecdotal. Okay, so I'll kind of talk about this very, very briefly. So I've done a lot of work in the past. Certainly my PhD stuff was around how active kids are during PE, and typically we find between about a third-ish, 40% of lesson time typically is spent engaged in moderate to vigorous levels of physical activity, but lots of variation there depending on age, type of activity going on, who the teacher is, where the location of the class is, and so on. So it's a bit of a mind thing to try and do well that kind of work. But the flip of that, and this was actually a real good undergrad project from John Moore's a few years ago, was looking at using observational methodologies, was to actually paint this other picture is that actually a large proportion of PE time is spent not being physically active, being inactive, and in some cases being very sedentary. So it's a real interesting kind of context to look at, because you can look at the pedagogy of it, and you can look at the class management, you can look at the physical effects of what's going on. So there's a lot of dynamics in play to kind of then reduce down to a simple number at the end of the day. But that's a metric that we can use, if you like, to demonstrate how good PE can be, or how effective PE can be in terms of activity promotion from a direct point of view. This was a systematic review then of PE interventions to increase physical activity in lesson time. So apologies for the size of the font here, but they kind of split them up by teaching strategy interventions. So the teacher kind of drives what's going to happen. So in our study in Liverpool here, we asked the teachers to, there was a teacher who taught a unit of work in gymnastics. As per the unit of work, the teacher taught the other class as per the unit of work in terms of content, but we said, okay, add an extra lesson objective to what you're going to plan. And that objective is to maximise physical activity during the lesson, but keep within the content. So they manipulated group sizes, equipment, and delivery style and so on. So that kind of puts some ownership back on the teachers, but the most effective types of interventions are where there's some high intensity integration of activity within the course of the lesson. So the effect sizes tend to be higher on a few of these kind of studies. Interestingly, there's an Ofsted report of PE in English schools. It was published last year or the year before. But one of the comments in that document was around the fact that lessons observed were not physically active, certainly not physically active enough to impact on young people's fitness. And that's a bit of a nod to this type of thing, really. I mean, PE can never really impact on kids' fitness because the frequency of PE lessons is not enough to do that. But I think that the message here is that the intensity of some phys ed isn't particularly high, which in some cases is totally warranted. But I guess in general terms, the report was suggesting it should be more active. So I'll just talk through very briefly one successful phys ed and school-based intervention, which is pretty old, to be quite honest now, but I think it stands the test of time because it's so well done. I know a lot of you will be familiar with the CATCH programme. I think it was originally called Child and Adolescent Trial of Cardiovascular Health, and repackaged and named as such. But this was a big programme in the States, involved 96 schools. Very well funded project. It was intervention, had some different components. So the PE component was the text in red, by the way, are aspect levels of the socio-ecological model that I showed you earlier. So just to demonstrate that it was really, really well thought through because it was underpinned by theory all the way through. Kind of food component, they changed the food and offer for the children. Had a family component and health ed component as well to kind of bridge the physical and after school. So a lot going on there. PE and VPA improved, out of school activity improved, not very much though, so they don't make a big song and dance about that in the catch papers. And so the kids' behaviour. So the take-home message is it was a success because it was very well funded, it was very big, and it was underpinned, very, very well resourced. I'll come back to that actually in relation to this point. Because it's quite an important one because what they saw here, some of those changes were actually sustained long after the intervention had ended. I'll come back to that. Okay. One more bullet. And it touches on what we'll talk about at the end, which is kind of translation, and that is a package, a bit like the Spark PE programme. There you go, let's commercialise it, go and use it. Practitioners can use the good stuff and use the messages within that. So, beyond PE, lots of other kind of, if you like, methodologies within school-based physical activity to promote health. So, straight through the curriculum. So, the Great Fun to Run, that was an initiative in the North East, linked to the Great North Run. So they had the actual highlight event as a target for children to work towards, and did some training around that. We did a programme here, that was a kind of a 9-month intervention, that was physical activity and healthy eating, delivered through PSHE classes, called the Change Project. Policy and environmental initiatives, this is Liverpool Sporting Playgrounds project, so redesign of the playground, so physical environment redesign. Policies such as, this is Safe Routes to School, which I know is North American. We can think about things like school travel plans, they have a physical activity component within them as policy level, as an example there. And then kind of more whole school approaches, so Action of Schools British Columbia was a participatory action model to promote physical activity and engage the whole school community. So lots of different ways to do this. And in some respects, these kind of interventions have some success, and in other respects, they are less effective for different reasons. So I guess some of the questions are, well, if these are such good ideas, why do they not always have success? Why are there sometimes limited effects, even though we have some positive findings? I've got a few thoughts on that, and some of those relate to, well, what do we measure? So in that project, for example, we measured a lot of things, which I'll talk about in a few minutes' time, but our outcome measure was not physical activity, it was waist circumference and body mass index, SED score, because we were interested in healthy size, healthy weight. Physical activity actually didn't change too much. There's a bit of an increase in light activity. So the selection of the outcome measure is important to measure success. How we measure the outcome is also important, and we're doing a lot of work at the moment on some of the technical aspects of measuring physical activity, but that's inherent with its own problems. Do we go in and try and target everybody, or do we actually try and have a little bit more targeted approach here? Do we actually think, well, who needs intervention the most? Let's work with that group. And again, that brings its own problems, particularly in a school kind of environment. Intervention design and then analysis are issues. A lot of studies don't follow up after the intervention has ended, so we can't really see if the changes have been sustained over time. Do we know that we can actually have something which works? Would it work if we scale it up and make it bigger and take it somewhere else? Does it have good reach to do that? And do interventions have the right resources to actually see an effect? So, okay, let's do some stuff with kids in the playground, let's change the environment, let's put some equipment out there. Good idea, but if we've not got the resources to have enough equipment for the children, then we can't really say whether it would work well or not. So lots of different things going on, and it raises a question because we know that typically physical activity decreases with age, irrespective of interventions. Is it realistic to try and increase children's physical activity? Or should we be more concerned about looking at things over maybe time and trying to look at kids maintaining what they're doing? I don't know about that, to be quite honest, but it's certainly, well, with limited resources, maybe we have to be realistic in terms of what our goals are. Okay, so some things perhaps which we could fix. What works? So a couple of systematic reviews from the last few years on the effectiveness of interventions, and I'll just highlight some comments from those. And what works? Well, multi-component interventions, links between school and family and community. And that's in adolescence. This is a 2007 review. At that time, limited evidence of the effectiveness of interventions in children, so up to the age of about 12. Now, that review was included in a review of reviews in 2011. More studies obviously included there, and again, multi-component approaches, including the family. It seems to be the thing that works. Interestingly though, the effects mostly seen in school-related activity rather than out-of-school activity. So multi-component interventions often show an overall effect, positive effect on physical activity, but when you segment activity in the school day out-of-school activity usually doesn't change too much, or it's not being measured. So it comes back to that measurement issue, or what's our outcome issue. So, multi-component seems to be a good thing. This is an example, very quickly, of the KISS multi-component intervention. This was conducted by Susie Creamer's group in Switzerland. And it had a few things going on. So they had 3 lessons a week, normal PE. The intervention kids had PE every single day, taught by specialists. PE homework. Teachers were given some professional development as well after the intervention ended. Breaks in the classroom, recess activities, etc. So, you know, building blocks put in place throughout the school day. Very effective intervention. They reported on adiposity and fitness and positive effects on those measures. So, I'll kind of talk through some of the research there. I guess to make that happen, it's important to recognise the importance of partnership working. So I'll come away from the literature a little bit and draw upon some reflections on some of the stuff that we've done over the last few years. Well, why is it important? So researchers, we need to, I think most people do realise it, but we need practitioners, commissioners and those people out there, out of our world. We really do need them. But they also need us, and they need us because we are the ones who can give an evidence base, provide the evidence base which should inform programmes and commissioning and services. And very often, certainly, I can only speak in the UK from the local authority work that I've done, very often it's, let's do this is a good idea, let's roll it out, let's put some money behind it, and it's public money. But there isn't an evidence base behind it, and there isn't a good design, there's no follow-up, there's no process evaluation built in. What are your outcome measures? There's no record. So there's all those things that as researchers would go, well, that's a prerequisite before we even start. So it's a kind of chicken and egg in some respects, and it's about gaining trust and gaining understanding of each other's worlds. Without the practitioners, commissioners, etc., we don't get access to the environment we want to work in. So that gatekeeper issue is so important to work with that person and go through the gate so you can actually do what you want to do. And they're important because if they don't work with you, then things, of course, will not happen in that school or in that playground or in that community group. And I think one of the things we often use as an oversight is that there should always be reciprocal benefits here. So we get what we want. What do we give back? What are they getting out of the process? And that's certainly something we've slowly got better with, I would say, in the last couple of years. But looking back, you feel a bit, all I've done there is take a lot of data away. You've not got a lot back from it, actually. So I'll just give an example of partnership working, and this is in Wigan. So we did some work. So in 2008, I was sat at home and a magazine plopped through the letterbox, and it was the kind of local authority, active living little update of what's going on in the community. I thought, okay, this sounds interesting. So I had a little look. So I sent a speculative email. So I kind of cold called on some of the people in the council, and kind of forced myself upon them to go and talk to them. To talk about what we did at John Moores University, and what we can offer you, and blah, blah, blah. And they gave us £2,000. I said, okay, well, we can come in, we use that money, we'll pay our undergrad students to come in, and we'll work with schools. And we did some surveillance work. We measured physical activity, we used our own accelerometers, we measured activity, we measured body comp, we did some self-perception stuff. And so we did that for about 2 years. So it's on a shoestring, but the schools got a report, and the local council got some data which fed into the joint assessment for health in terms of the picture of health in that particular year group. So it's pretty small scale. It's probably about 500 kids went through that programme. But for £2,000, it's not a bad kind of return. So it's an example of kind of dipping the toe in the water, but actually meeting some really important people. I don't mean important in terms of the job title, but they were the people who, so the PSHE manager in the council, who had all the schools eaten out of a hand, worked with us and really liked what we did. And so straight away we had good access, and we had good relationships with the teachers. So that was a precursor to the change intervention. So we then got introduced to some of the commissioners in the council who supported us. And we worked with them actually in terms of, well, we knew who our partners would be then, we knew maybe what schools we might want to work with, we knew who in the local authority would be good to work with. But we worked together to actually think about these different aspects of the intervention. So it wasn't just done by us, we did it in collaboration. And that programme ran till about, I think 2011, excuse me. And it's a bit of a lull period, because as councils restructure, people move on and different personnel are there. But last year we picked things up with that local authority. So there's an MPhil student now who's had some funding at John Moores to do some work in Wigan, and that's going to be extended for another couple of years into her PhD. So actually from building a relationship up in 2008, things have kind of moved on. Without that initial hello, can I come and talk to you, that would never have ever actually happened. So it's really important, and that wasn't, I'm being a bit disingenuous there, that wasn't just because I did that and said, hello, let me come do this. It's because myself and colleagues, and we worked hard to build up those relationships and got to know and got to gain the trust of the people, if you like, on the ground, and that worked well. Now, this project was a multidisciplinary intervention, so that kind of brings me on to the exercise science, phys ed, and meshing that together. So this is some data collection pictures. So we've got, we did some nutrition stuff. So we had a couple of nutritionists working on the project. We had some qualitative element to the project. We needed expertise there. We had a whole range of lab measures, so cardiovascular, these are ultrasounds, DEXA scans, some questionnaire work. We had lab and field-based measures of fitness. We had physical activity monitoring, typical kind of anthropometry, and we had fundamental movement skills as well. So I couldn't do all that because I've not got the expertise across that, but we had a good team who were actually would work together, and they were from the university group, but this comes back to the partnership working. We could not have done these bits in the labs without Wigan Council paying for transport. So they put some money into that. Not a lot, but it actually allowed it to happen. This guy, he's a physical activity officer at Wigan Council. He was released 1 day a week. Our FMS guy trained him up to observe and then analyse fundamental movement skill data. So he had another string to his bow which he could then share with colleagues. And obviously his time was free to the project. So there were some in-kind benefits, and we had admin staff at the council who also did some data inputting. So the partnership went beyond can we get access to schools? Yeah, off you go, off you trot. It actually became a little bit more tangible. We had some people, we had a little bit of in-kind benefits as well. And of course we had multidisciplinary expertise from the academics. And that was a great project in terms of, so we were looking at metrics of outputs and ref and so on. We got some good papers written from that particular project. Okay, so some lessons learned from that experience. Really early engagement of the stakeholders and partners and working with them and not really taking things for granted was important for us. And getting to know who the right people were that you need to work with. And we did some early work, so we didn't just dive into the intervention. We spent a year doing the qualitative work, some formative work. We spoke to kids, spoke to teachers, spoke to families. What works for you? What would an intervention look like for you? And that allowed us to design stuff. Not easy though. We were, the university funded the project, so we had a lot of ownership over what we could do. That might not be deemed that important by an external funder. And then we combined that evidence from the empirical evidence to try and design the intervention. What works for this community? What do they need? And I guess that lesson was learned, probably not as well as it should have been, but a willingness to actually give back. And so they got a glossy brochure, and we did a presentation to head teachers and so on and so forth. Could have done more, to be quite honest with you. So multi-component approaches need multidisciplinary teams. So as illustrated by the pictures, actually we go beyond just the phys ed guy or the physical activity guy or the physiologist or the FMS person here. We need teams of people who can pull together to match the outcomes of the project, but we also need those people to be able to work with a range of professionals. Right? Particularly challenging when you've got, say, grad students working on projects. So can they actually have hold their own accommodation with a head teacher, for example? Can they actually talk to people who are going to fund or commission projects or services? So it's about actually changing your language and communication skills for the audience as well, and how adept are we at actually doing that. And I think you probably all agree that we can't really research in isolation. We've got to actually join hands, and collective good is what makes things work. So kind of bring things to a close. Another model there, here we go. So this is the behavioural epidemiological framework. It's a really important framework for anyone who kind of studies in the physical activity epidemiology area. It's kind of a cyclical number of phases, if you like. And I've touched on these a little bit around kind of methods, measuring activity, what are the correlates, interventions, but this is the last part here. Well, what things work, how do we translate that and apply that into practice or to policy? So, a few thoughts on this. So we often do research in schools, but the question sometimes goes, well, what happens to that project after the project's finished? And very often the answer is nothing. It just stops, and everyone goes back to what we did before. So these things are really important. So what's our strategy for translating the findings or disseminating what we've been doing and what we've found out? So, we've got typical media like reports, presentations, going back into the schools and class presentations, assemblies, and putting the language in terms that the children understand, or meeting with the parents, using social media, etc., etc., etc. So actually making that part of the project and a real significant phase of the project. Do we pay enough attention to this? Probably not. I'd say that honestly from my point of view. But it's really important that we appreciate the importance of working with partners on these kind of things, and that we build any stuff around translation and dissemination at the start of the process into what the expectations are. It's not just about producing data and evaluating a project, it's saying, well, what do we do with it? Because we're the scientists and we understand all the technical stuff, but that's not really language that normal people use, so we need to find good ways of actually communicating what we do. And I think there's also a responsibility on schools, if there's good work being done, to actually continue the effective practices once that programme finishes, and feeling that they want to do that. So an example, I mentioned the CATCH programme earlier. So this was the CATCH institutionalisation study. So this was post 5 years at the end of the intervention. So they went and measured a bunch of the schools again. And this was, so the metrics here were, well, okay, these intervention schools who had finished 5 years earlier, they spent longer over the course of the year teaching the CATCH lesson content. And they taught more of those kind of lessons than the former comparison schools did. The comparison schools at the end of the project received all the materials, yeah, but didn't get it in the intervention time, so they had the resource to do that. And the key here was the fact that those schools had, the teachers had been trained, and they maintained that, and I presume when there was turnover of staff, that training was actually cascaded down, so there were still experts in the school who could actually do that work. Really important, I think. So, just after 5, so I'm not really too bad. Some difficulties, I think, sometimes. So, often this work is quite modest in its scale, and then that makes it difficult for us to actually make claims about its effectiveness. And that's often down to money, potentially, but also time. And sometimes what we're trying to get out of this, what is the shared vision? So we've got different parties involved, and perhaps not everyone's maybe singing in the same direction. Formative pilot work, if it's methods development, if it's finding out the needs of the population, or if it's at the back end, long-term follow-up. So the front and the back end are really important, as well as the actual intervention side of it, if we're doing intervention work. But again, big restraints on that. And so local authorities, if we're working with those very often, they won't justify a budget for evaluation, for example, to do, okay, we've got a programme, but we're not going to pay you to come and actually evaluate it. But if you've got some students who want to come in, then yeah, they can do it for nothing. The quality's not quite there for that. And I said earlier, the evidence base often, not always, but often doesn't support some of the services and programmes that are rolled out. And so justifying these kind of costs can be challenging. However, the last meeting we had with the guys at Wigan that I just alluded to, we were all like, oh my God, we've got to tell them how much it's going to cost now. And they were like, well, yeah, that sounds very reasonable. Because I guess we're a little bit kind of shy, I think, with these kind of things in academia, but I think people in the real world, when they deal with real full economic costs and stuff, when we talk about direct costs, the fractional compared to what the real cost of things sometimes are. So sometimes I think we need to be a bit bolder and a bit more confident in getting this stuff over, because there is a cost attached to it. Just coming back then, so coming back to physical education, where I am now in terms of me leading a programme around that, but actually trying to drive some research with that group of staff. But at the same time, this is why I've called it this, having a remit of building up a physical activity health research endeavour, if you like, and it is ground zero because it's me. But the good thing is I got signed off for my activity monitoring kit last week, so I'll have some equipment as well from the new year. So that's a challenge, having come from an environment where loads of colleagues who have spoke about and loads of kit and 5-star facilities, etc. I'm not moaning, it's a good challenge. But it really emphasises for me this. Okay? Alright, so I've spent a lot of my time in the last 9 weeks, I've been at Edge Hill, doing those cold call emails, meeting school sport partnership people, meeting council people in the new local community where I'm working. And it's like putting the hard yards in. And the response has been very, very positive, because if you work with people who are like-minded, want to do that work, but they've not had actually a resource in a person or expertise, then actually we're speaking the same language. So I mean, touch wood, that will go well. I don't know if it will, but it's all about, for me, relationships, partnerships, gaining trust, and then maybe if I come back next year, I'll tell you how that's actually gone. I'm still there. Okay, thank you for listening.